I never thought I'd be the one writing something like this. For years, I've read stories about betrayal and heartbreak, but I always believed my life was different. Stable. Perfect even. But here I am, pouring out my soul to strangers on the internet because I don't know what else to do. Let me set the stage for you. My name is Mark. I'm 38 years old, and until a few months ago, I had what I thought was a dream life. I had a beautiful wife, Julia, 2 amazing kids, and a comfortable home. Julia worked as a nurse at a busy hospital, and I ran my own small tech business. We were busy, sure, but we always made time for family dinners, weekend movie nights, and summer vacations. Our kids, Mia and Ryan, are 10 and 7. They're everything to me. Mia's this bright, artistic soul who can turn a cardboard box into a masterpiece. Ryan's a little engineer, always building something with his Legos or taking apart gadgets to figure out how they work. They were happy. We were happy. Or so I thought. It started with little things. Julia began working longer hours. She'd come home late, claiming she was swamped at the hospital. I didn't think much of it. Her job's demanding, and I trusted her. But then there were the phone calls. She'd step out of the room to take them, her voice hushed, her laughter forced. I told myself I was imagining things. Paranoia wasn't going to help anything, right? One night, as I was tucking Mia and Ryan into bed, Mia said something that made my heart sink. "Dad, why does Mom have to work so late?" She missed my play again. Her voice was small, hurt. And it hit me, this wasn't just about me feeling uneasy. Something was off. I decided to talk to Julia about it. "Is everything okay?" I asked her one night as we sat on the couch. "You've been so busy lately. The kids miss you." She gave me this tired smile and said, "It's just work, Mark. You know how it is. People rely on me." I wanted to believe her. I did believe her. But the doubt had been planted, and it wouldn't go away. Then came the first real crack in the facade. I was cleaning up the kitchen one evening when Julia's phone buzzed on the counter. She'd left it there when she went to shower. It was a text from someone named Mike. "Thanks for today. Can't wait to see you again." My stomach dropped. Who the hell was Mike? Why was he thanking her? Why did he want to see her again? I didn't confront her that night. I needed more information, proof. So I did something I'm not proud of. I started checking her phone when she wasn't looking. And what I found, it destroyed me. Julia had been meeting patients outside of work. At first, the messages seemed innocent enough, checking in, offering support. But they quickly turned into something else. Flirty. Intimate. With multiple men. She even told one of them she loved him. I couldn't breathe. My hands were shaking as I put her phone back. I didn't sleep that night. All I could think about was our kids, our life, the years we'd built together. Was it all a lie? Was I just some clueless fool while she lived a double life? The next morning, I went through the motions. Got the kids ready for school, kissed them goodbye, and watched Julia leave for work like nothing was wrong. But inside, something in me had snapped. I wasn't going to let this slide. I couldn't. My family deserved better. And so began my plan. A plan that would change everything. After discovering those messages, I couldn't stop myself from digging deeper. Every time Julia left the house, I felt this insatiable urge to find out more. I started tracking her movements, checking her phone when she left it unattended, and even going through her work bag when she wasn't looking. It felt wrong, invasive, but I couldn't let it go. I needed answers. One night, while Julia was out, working late, I finally hit a breakthrough. I accessed her email. She used a shared laptop occasionally, and her account was still logged in. What I found wasn't just incriminating. It was horrifying. There were dozens of messages to and from patients. At first glance, they seemed like the usual professional follow-ups, but buried among them were messages that painted a different picture. She wasn't just engaging in emotional affairs, she was meeting these men outside of work. There were details about dates, times, even hotels. My blood boiled as I read. How could she do this? To me, to our kids? Julia had always been a devoted mother, or so I thought. But here she was, living this secret life while I stayed home, holding our family together. The worst message came from a man named Greg. He wasn't just a patient, he was a married man, and Julia had been helping him through a tough time. His emails were filled with sickeningly sweet words about how she'd saved him, how she was his light in the dark. And Julia's replies? She said she felt the same, that he made her feel alive. Alive? What about us? What about the life we built together? I didn't confront her that night either. Instead, I started collecting evidence. Every email, every text, every shred of proof I could find. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it yet, but I knew I couldn't confront her without being fully prepared. Julia was smart, and if she caught wind of my suspicions, she might cover her tracks. Then came the moment that truly shattered me. I found a picture. A selfie she'd taken with Greg in a hospital parking lot. She was wearing her scrubs, smiling, leaning into him like they were teenagers in love. And him? He was grinning, his hand on her waist like he owned her. My wife. My Julia. That night I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat in our living room, staring at that picture, trying to make sense of it all. I thought about Mia and Ryan, how their world would crumble if they knew. I thought about our home, our memories, everything we'd shared. And then I thought about Greg and the others. Men who had no idea how much they'd taken from me. But the worst was yet to come. The next day, Julia came home earlier than expected. She looked surprised to see me sitting at the kitchen table, her phone in my hand. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice wary. For a moment, I considered confronting her then and there, letting her know I'd uncovered everything. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled, a tight, forced smile, and handed her the phone. "Nothing," I said. "Just checking the time." Her expression softened, and she kissed me on the cheek before heading upstairs. I watched her go, my hands trembling with suppressed rage. If she thought I was just going to let this go, she was sorely mistaken. I had a plan now. A plan that would not only expose her lies but ensure she could never rebuild the life she was so eager to destroy. But to execute it, I needed time, patience, and precision. Julia had underestimated me, and she was about to learn the hard way that I wasn't a man to be crossed. What I discovered next would turn my plan into something much darker than I'd ever imagined. The following week, I continued playing the part of the clueless, supportive husband. Every time Julia left the house, I worked on my plan. I started researching Greg and the other men she was involved with. Greg was easy to find. He owned a small landscaping company not far from our neighborhood. A little digging on social media revealed that he, too, had a family, a wife and 2 young boys. I felt sick. These weren't just faceless men. They had lives, families, people who loved them. And Julia was ripping those lives apart just like she had ours. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became. This wasn't just betrayal. This was destruction. And I wasn't going to let it continue. I started keeping a journal, meticulously documenting everything I discovered. Every text, every email, every photograph, every inconsistency in Julia's stories. I even installed a GPS tracker on her car, something I never thought I'd do in a million years. But desperate times called for desperate measures. It didn't take long for the tracker to pay off. One evening, Julia told me she was working a double shift at the hospital. As soon as she left, I pulled up the tracker app on my phone. Sure enough, her car wasn't heading to the hospital. It was heading to a hotel on the outskirts of town. My heart pounded as I watched the little blinking dot on the screen. I didn't follow her. Not yet. I needed more time to prepare. But knowing where she was and what she was doing made my blood boil. She was with him. Greg. I was sure of it. That night, when she came home, I pretended to be asleep. She slipped into bed beside me like nothing had happened, her hair still damp from a shower. The audacity. The sheer disrespect. But I stayed quiet. I had to bide my time. The next morning, I made a decision. If Julia was going to throw away our marriage, I was going to make sure she felt the full weight of her actions. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about protecting my kids, ensuring they didn't grow up thinking this kind of betrayal was normal or acceptable. I reached out to a private investigator. I didn't want to leave anything to chance. The PI was a no-nonsense woman named Sarah, and within minutes of our first conversation, I knew I'd made the right choice. She promised to gather everything I needed: photographs, videos, concrete evidence that would stand up in court. I gave her Julia's schedule, her usual haunts, and the names of the men I'd uncovered. Sarah didn't flinch. "We'll get this done," she said, her voice steely. "You deserve the truth." While Sarah worked, I focused on the next phase of my plan. I started putting money aside in a separate account, preparing for the worst. I knew Julia would fight dirty once the truth came out, and I needed to be ready. I also began discreetly reaching out to lawyers, exploring my options for custody and divorce. It felt surreal, planning the dismantling of my life. But every time I looked at Mia and Ryan, I knew I was doing the right thing. They deserved a stable home, a parent they could trust. And Julia? She didn't deserve to walk away unscathed. The tipping point came 2 weeks later. Sarah called me with an update. "We have everything," she said. "Your wife's been meeting Greg at the hotel regularly. We have photos, videos, timestamps. It's airtight." I thanked her, my voice barely above a whisper. My hands were trembling as I hung up the phone. It was time. Time to confront Julia, to lay everything out on the table. But as I sat there, staring at the folder of evidence Sarah had sent me, a darker thought crept into my mind. Confrontation wasn't enough. She needed to understand the depth of the pain she'd caused. She needed to feel it. And Greg? He wasn't going to walk away from this unscathed either. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about revenge. Julia's betrayal consumed me. Every time she smiled at me, every time she kissed the kids goodnight, I wanted to scream. How could she act so normal, so innocent, while tearing our family apart? But I kept my emotions in check. I wasn't ready to tip my hand just yet. That weekend, I put my plan into motion. I arranged for Mia and Ryan to spend the night at their grandparents'. Julia didn't question it. She said she had another, long shift, at the hospital anyway. Perfect. As soon as the kids were gone, I set the stage. I printed out every piece of evidence Sarah had gathered, photos of Julia and Greg entering the hotel together, timestamps, and even receipts from their meetups. I placed them all in a neat folder and left it on the kitchen table. Then I waited. Julia came home around midnight, her hair damp, the faint smell of hotel shampoo clinging to her. She froze when she saw me sitting in the living room, the folder in plain sight on the table. "Mark," she said, forcing a smile. "Why are you still up?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stood and walked over to the table, placing my hand on the folder. "We need to talk," I said, my voice calm but ice cold. She hesitated, her eyes flickering to the folder. "What's this?" "Sit down," I said. "You'll want to see this." Reluctantly, she sat across from me. I slid the folder toward her and watched as she opened it. Her face went pale as she flipped through the pages, her hands trembling. "Mark, I can explain." "Explain what?" I snapped, my voice rising. "That you've been sneaking off to hotels with Greg? That you've been lying to me and the kids for months? What exactly do you think you can explain, Julia?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Tears filled her eyes, and for a moment, I thought she might actually feel remorse. But then she said something that sent me over the edge. "You don't understand. I didn't mean for this to happen." "You didn't mean for this to happen?" I repeated, incredulous. "You didn't mean to betray your husband? To tear apart your family? Stop pretending this was some accident, Julia. You made choices. And now you're going to face the consequences." She started sobbing, but I didn't let her off the hook. "Do you know what hurts the most?" I said, my voice breaking despite myself. It's not just the betrayal. It's that you didn't even think about how this would affect our kids. Mia and Ryan look up to you. They adore you. And you threw it all away, for what? A fling? A little excitement? I love you, Mark, she said through her tears. I do. I don't know what's wrong with me. I laughed bitterly. You love me? That's rich. People don't destroy the ones they love, Julia. She reached across the table, but I pulled away. Don't, I said coldly. You've done enough. She looked shattered, but I didn't care. Not anymore. Here's what's going to happen, I said, leaning forward. You're going to pack a bag and leave. Tonight. I'll figure out what to tell the kids, but you don't get to stay here and play the victim. Mark, please. No. I slammed my hand on the table, and she flinched. We're done, Julia. You made your choice. Now live with it. She stared at me for a long moment, then nodded, defeated. Without another word, she got up and went upstairs. I heard her moving around, packing her things, and then the front door closed behind her. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty folder on the table. The confrontation was over, but this was just the beginning. I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. When Julia left that night, it felt like the house was holding its breath. Everything was too quiet, too still. I sat there for hours, replaying the confrontation in my mind, wondering if I'd made the right call. But every time I thought of Mia and Ryan, I knew I had. They deserved better. We all did. The next morning, I woke up early, exhausted but determined. The kids were still at their grandparents', so I used the time to clean up any trace of Julia. I boxed up her remaining belongings and placed them in the garage. The house felt emptier without her things, but it also felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted. Julia didn't contact me that day, or the next. When I picked up Mia and Ryan, I told them that their mom had to stay at work for a while. It wasn't a lie, not entirely. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth, not yet. They were too young to understand, and I didn't want to shatter their image of her. Not until I had a better plan. Meanwhile, I kept gathering information. Sarah had done an incredible job with the evidence, but I wasn't finished. I needed to ensure Julia couldn't manipulate her way back into our lives, or into the kids' lives, without facing the consequences of what she'd done. That meant I had to make her actions public. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Greg's wife, Rachel, contacted me. She'd found my number through Sarah, who had reached out to her as part of the investigation. When Rachel called, her voice was shaking. Mark, she said, I think we need to talk. We met at a small coffee shop the next day. Rachel looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in weeks. I didn't want to believe it, she said, sliding a manila envelope across the table. But when Sarah showed me the photos, I couldn't ignore it. I opened the envelope and found more evidence. Photos of Greg and Julia together, text messages Rachel had discovered on his phone, even a receipt for flowers he'd sent Julia. It was like a puzzle coming together, each piece more damning than the last. What are you going to do? Rachel asked, her voice trembling. I stared at the evidence, my mind racing. I'm not sure yet, I admitted. But I can't let this slide. Not for my kids. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Same here. My boys don't deserve this. I don't deserve this. We talked for hours, sharing stories of betrayal, trying to make sense of what had happened. By the end of the conversation, we had a plan. If Julia and Greg thought they could destroy our families without consequences, they were in for a rude awakening. The next step was public exposure. Rachel and I agreed to send anonymous packages to Julia's hospital and Greg's business, containing all the evidence we'd gathered. We weren't trying to be cruel, we just wanted the truth to come out. People deserved to know who they really were. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. Within days, Julia was called into a meeting with her superiors. I didn't know the exact details, but I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was placed on leave while they investigated allegations of unprofessional conduct. Greg faced similar consequences at his company. Rachel sent me a text the day he was confronted. He's furious. Trying to blame me. I don't care anymore. The revenge was satisfying, but it wasn't enough. Julia and Greg's betrayal had ripped a hole in our lives, and exposing them didn't fill it. It was time to focus on the future, on rebuilding, on protecting Mia and Ryan from the fallout. But even as I tried to move forward, a part of me couldn't let go of the anger. And that part of me wasn't finished yet. With Julia and Greg publicly exposed, I felt a grim satisfaction. Their reputations were crumbling, and they were starting to experience the consequences of their actions. But as much as it felt like a victory, it wasn't enough. My family had been shattered, and I wasn't done making them pay for what they'd done. Julia attempted to reach out a few days later. She called multiple times, leaving voicemails that ranged from tearful apologies to desperate pleas. I ignored them all. Then she showed up at the house. I watched from the window as she stood on the porch, knocking softly at first and then louder when I didn't respond. I didn't let her in. She didn't deserve to step foot in this house anymore. But she didn't leave quietly. Later that evening, I got a message from her. You're being unreasonable. We need to talk for the kids' sake. It was almost laughable. Now she cared about the kids? Now she wanted to talk? I blocked her number. If she wanted to communicate, she could do it through a lawyer. Meanwhile, I kept working on the next phase of my plan. Sarah had suggested taking the legal route, divorce, custody, and financial separation, but I wanted more than that. Julia had not only betrayed me but jeopardized our children's stability. I couldn't let her walk away with any power in this situation. I met with a lawyer, laying out everything I had. The evidence, the timeline, even Sarah's reports. The lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense man named Ethan, listened intently. You've got a solid case, he said after I finished. With this much evidence, you can argue for full custody and limited visitation rights for her. Courts don't look kindly on this kind of behavior, especially when kids are involved. That's what I want, I said. I want to make sure she has no chance of influencing the kids. I don't want them growing up thinking this is normal. Ethan nodded. We'll get started right away. But be prepared, if she decides to fight, it could get messy. Messy didn't scare me. I was ready for whatever Julia threw my way. As the legal wheels turned, I decided to take things a step further. Greg had gotten off too easily, in my opinion. Sure, his reputation was damaged, and his wife was on the brink of leaving him, but it wasn't enough. He needed to understand the full extent of the destruction he'd caused. I found out where Greg worked, a small landscaping business he owned. With a little digging, I uncovered his client list. Using a fake email account, I sent anonymous messages to some of his biggest clients, attaching the evidence of his affair with Julia. The messages were simple. This is the kind of man you're trusting with your property. I knew it was petty, but I didn't care. Greg deserved to lose everything, just like I had. The fallout was swift. Rachel called me a week later, her voice filled with grim satisfaction. Greg's losing contracts left and right, she said. He doesn't know who's behind it, but he's furious. Good, I said simply. He deserves it. Rachel laughed softly. I didn't think I'd ever say this, but thank you. You've helped me see that I don't have to tolerate this anymore. She filed for divorce soon after, and Greg's life continued to spiral. Watching his downfall gave me a sense of justice, but it also left me feeling hollow. No amount of revenge could undo the damage he and Julia had caused. Despite everything, I still had moments of doubt. Was I doing the right thing? Was I letting my anger consume me? But every time I saw Mia and Ryan, I knew I had to keep going. They deserved a stable, secure future, one without Julia's chaos or Greg's toxicity looming over us. As the legal battle with Julia heated up, I prepared for the final phase of my plan. What Julia and Greg didn't know was that I'd been recording everything. Every conversation, every voicemail, every interaction since the day I'd confronted Julia. And those recordings? They were about to become very public. I'd held back one last card, one that I knew would completely destroy Julia and Greg's ability to maintain their lies. Over the weeks of planning, I'd recorded every voicemail Julia left, saved screenshots of her texts, and even captured audio from a few confrontations she'd had with Greg when she thought no one was listening. These recordings painted a clear picture of who they truly were: deceitful, manipulative, and unapologetic. Julia still had a few people who believed her sob story. Some of her colleagues from the hospital, even a few mutual friends, reached out to me, urging me to talk things out and find a way to move past this. It was infuriating. They didn't know the truth, not yet. But I was about to change that. I created a folder online, password protected and anonymous. It contained everything: the photos, the emails, the videos Sarah had captured, and the recordings I'd made. It was irrefutable proof of their betrayal. Then, using another fake email, I sent the link to key people in Julia's life: her colleagues, her family, and even a few mutual friends who had doubted me. I titled the email simply, "The Truth About Julia and Greg." Within hours, the fallout began. Julia called me in a panic. It was the first time I'd heard her voice since I'd blocked her number. She left a voicemail, her voice shaking with anger and desperation. "How could you do this, Mark? You've ruined everything. You're vindictive and cruel. What kind of father are you?" The irony of her words nearly made me laugh. She was trying to paint herself as the victim yet again. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Meanwhile, Greg was dealing with his own explosion. Rachel called me again, laughing bitterly. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "Greg got kicked out of his business partnership. His clients are dropping him like flies. He's blaming me, of course, but I told him he did this to himself." "Good," I said. "He deserves every bit of it." For Julia, the exposure had devastating consequences. Her hospital's administration called an emergency meeting to address the situation. According to a friend who worked there, Julia's superiors couldn't ignore the evidence I'd sent. They placed her on indefinite suspension, pending an investigation into whether her behavior violated any professional ethics codes. She was furious, humiliated, and desperate to save what little she had left. But the most satisfying moment came when Julia's family contacted me. Her parents, who had always adored her, were horrified by what they'd learned. Her mother called me, crying, apologizing for her daughter's actions. "We had no idea," she said. "We're so sorry for what you and the kids have been through." "It's not your fault," I told her. Julia made her choices. Even with everything crumbling around her, Julia still tried to fight me in court. She hired an expensive lawyer, hoping to salvage custody of Mia and Ryan. But Ethan was prepared. With the mountain of evidence we'd gathered, Julia's case didn't stand a chance. The judge awarded me full custody, with Julia's visitation rights reduced to supervised weekends at best. It wasn't just a victory, it was a message. She'd lost the right to be a full-time mother, just as she'd lost my trust. As the dust settled, I realized something unexpected. For weeks, I'd been consumed by anger, plotting revenge, and exposing Julia and Greg for the people they truly were. But now that it was done, I felt empty. The satisfaction of watching their lives fall apart didn't fill the void they'd left behind. What did fill that void, though, was Mia and Ryan. They were my reason for everything. And now, I could finally focus on rebuilding our lives, free from the lies and betrayal that had nearly destroyed us. With Julia out of the house and the legal battle settled, life slowly began to stabilize. Mia and Ryan were my primary focus. They were still too young to understand the full extent of what had happened, but they felt the shift. Mia asked me one night, her voice quiet, "Is Mom ever coming back?" I knelt down to her level, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Your mom loves you," I said carefully. "But things are different now. She needs to figure some things out on her own. For now, it's just us, okay?" She nodded, her small shoulders trembling as she hugged me. Ryan was quieter about it all, but he clung to me more than usual, his little hands always reaching for mine. They needed me more than ever, and I wasn't going to let them down. To help them adjust, I created new routines. We had game nights, trips to the park, and even small weekend adventures to distract them from the absence of their mother. Slowly, the tension in our home began to fade. The laughter returned. It wasn't the same, but it was a start. Julia, however, wasn't content to let go. Despite the court ruling, she began sending messages through intermediaries, family members, mutual friends, even old neighbors. She painted herself as the victim, claiming I was keeping the kids away from her. It was infuriating, but I refused to engage. I had made my decision, and I wasn't going to let her manipulate me again. One evening, Mia found an envelope slipped under the door. Inside was a letter from Julia. It was addressed to both kids, filled with flowery apologies and promises that she'd be back in their lives soon. I was livid. Julia wasn't supposed to contact them directly without going through proper channels. I took the letter and filed it away with the rest of the evidence, knowing it could be useful if she tried to contest custody again. But I didn't stop there. I reached out to Sarah one last time. I needed to ensure Julia wouldn't overstep her boundaries. Sarah suggested installing a security system with cameras and alarms, just in case. "It's better to be prepared," she said. "You don't want her showing up unannounced." She was right. I wasn't taking any chances. Within days, the system was in place. Julia wouldn't be able to get near the house without me knowing. Meanwhile, Greg's life continued to unravel. Rachel finalized her divorce, taking their 2 boys and moving to a new city. Greg, from what I heard, was drowning in debt and losing his business. A small part of me felt pity for him, but it was overshadowed by the memory of what he'd done to my family. As the weeks turned into months, I began to see glimpses of a new beginning. I found joy in the little moments: Ryan's excitement when he built a new Lego creation, Mia's proud smile as she showed me her latest drawing. They were thriving despite everything. And for the first time in a long while, I felt hope. But just as I thought the worst was behind us, something happened that shook everything. One afternoon, I received a call from the hospital where Julia worked. It wasn't her, but one of her colleagues. "Mr. Carter," the woman said, her voice hesitant. "I think you should know, Julia's been telling people she plans to take the kids. She's been saying some unsettling things." My heart sank. "What kind of things?" "She's convinced that you're manipulating them against her," the woman said. "She's been talking about taking matters into her own hands. I thought you should be aware." I thanked her and hung up, my mind racing. Julia was desperate, and desperate people did dangerous things. I'd thought I'd done enough to protect us, but now I wasn't so sure. It was clear that Julia wasn't done with us. And if she thought she could take the kids, she was about to find out just how far I was willing to go to stop her. The warning from Julia's colleague left me on edge. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. I double-checked the locks every night, made sure the new security system was working, and kept my phone within arm's reach at all times. But no amount of preparation could ease the knot in my stomach. One night, just as I was tucking Mia and Ryan into bed, the doorbell rang. My heart sank. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I told the kids to stay upstairs and quietly made my way to the door. Through the peephole, I saw her, Julia. She looked disheveled, her hair a mess and her eyes wild. "Mark, I just want to talk," she called through the door, her voice frantic. "Please, just let me in." I didn't open the door. "You're not supposed to be here, Julia," I said firmly. "You need to leave." "I'm their mother," she shouted, her voice breaking. "You can't keep them from me. I deserve to see my kids." Her desperation was palpable, but I couldn't risk letting her in. "You can talk to your lawyer," I said coldly. "This isn't the way to handle things." She banged on the door, her fist hitting the wood hard enough to rattle it. "You're turning them against me," she screamed. "They're my kids too." At that moment, the security camera by the door beeped, letting me know it was recording everything. I felt a small sense of relief knowing I'd have evidence if she tried to twist this into something it wasn't. After a few minutes, she finally gave up and stormed off, her car screeching down the street. The kids had heard the commotion. Mia came downstairs, her eyes wide. "Was that Mom?" I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "She just wanted to talk, sweetheart. Everything's okay. Go back to bed." But everything wasn't okay. Julia's behavior was escalating, and I couldn't ignore the warning signs. The next morning, I contacted Ethan, my lawyer, and showed him the footage from the security camera. "This is enough to file a restraining order," he said. "We'll take it to the court immediately." The restraining order was granted within days. Julia was now legally prohibited from coming near the house or contacting me directly. It was a small victory, but it didn't feel like enough. I knew Julia wouldn't stop until she'd convinced herself she was in the right. That night, I received a text from an unknown number. It was Julia. "You can't do this to me, Mark. I'll get my kids back. You'll see." I blocked the number and forwarded the message to Ethan. The final straw came 2 days later. I came home from picking up the kids at school to find Julia's car parked across the street. She wasn't in it, but the sight of it sent a chill down my spine. I ushered Mia and Ryan into the house and locked the door. The police arrived within minutes after I called them. By the time they got there, Julia was gone, but her car was still parked in the same spot. They towed it away and promised to investigate, but it was clear that Julia was becoming a serious threat. That night, as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, I realized I couldn't keep living like this. Julia wasn't going to stop, and I couldn't let her disrupt our lives any further. I needed to take decisive action, something that would ensure she couldn't come near us again. The next morning, I called Ethan. "I want to pursue full legal custody," I said. "No visitation rights. Nothing." Ethan paused for a moment. "That's a big step, Mark. Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I said. "I need to protect my kids. And I'm not going to let Julia ruin their lives." The decision to pursue full custody was not one I made lightly, but Julia had left me no choice. Every step she took pushed her further into desperation, and her actions had crossed too many lines. I couldn't allow her instability to jeopardize Mia and Ryan's well-being. Ethan worked quickly to file the necessary paperwork. He was confident that with the evidence we had, including the security footage, her threatening messages, and the restraining order, the court would rule in my favor. But as we prepared for the final hearing, Julia's behavior grew even more erratic. One evening, while I was helping Mia with her homework, I received a call from Sarah. "Mark," she said urgently, "I just got word from one of my contacts. Julia's been talking to someone about leaving town with the kids. She's desperate." My blood ran cold. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Sarah said. "It's not clear how serious she is, but I thought you should know. Be vigilant." That night I barely slept. I double-checked the locks, tested the security system, and even stayed awake in the living room, waiting for any sign of trouble. Thankfully, nothing happened, but the warning had shaken me to my core. I knew Julia wasn't capable of rational decisions anymore. The court hearing came 2 weeks later. Julia showed up with a new lawyer, looking haggard but defiant. She claimed I was alienating her from the kids, that I was manipulating the situation to make her look bad. But the evidence spoke for itself. Ethan presented a devastating case, laying out every piece of documentation we had gathered over the months. When Julia took the stand, she tried to justify her actions, even crying as she described how much she missed Mia and Ryan. But when Ethan cross-examined her, her story began to crumble. He played the security footage of her banging on my door and presented the threatening text messages she had sent. By the time he was done, Julia was visibly shaken. The judge ruled in my favor. I was awarded full custody of Mia and Ryan, and Julia's visitation rights were revoked indefinitely. She was also ordered to undergo therapy and anger management before she could even petition for supervised visits. It was the closure I had been fighting for, but it came with a heavy weight. No one wins in these situations, not really. But I knew I had done what was necessary to protect my children. After the ruling, Julia approached me outside the courthouse. Her eyes were red and swollen, but there was an edge of bitterness in her voice. "You've taken everything from me," she said quietly. "No, Julia," I replied. "You did this to yourself. I just made sure the kids were safe." She didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. It was the last time I saw her. In the months that followed, life began to settle. Mia and Ryan flourished in the stability of our new routine. I focused on being the best father I could be, rebuilding their trust and ensuring they felt loved and supported. There were still hard days, moments when they asked about their mom or struggled with the changes, but we faced them together, as a family. As for Julia, I heard through the grapevine that she moved to a different city and started over. She reached out once through the courts, requesting a chance to see the kids, but the judge denied her request based on her lack of progress in therapy. I knew she might try again someday, but I was ready to fight for my kids' safety if it came to that. Looking back, the journey had been brutal, filled with heartbreak and anger. But it had also shown me the strength I didn't know I had, the strength to protect my family, to rise above betrayal, and to rebuild what had been broken. Mia and Ryan were my light in the darkness, my reason to keep moving forward. And as I watched them laugh and play in the backyard one sunny afternoon, I knew we were finally free. This was our new beginning, a life built on truth, love, and resilience. If you want more stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.